Matthew chapter 26. As we dive in, I realize over the last year, maybe if you look back over the year behind us, some of you have experienced some of the most difficult things of your life. There are many of you that experienced the death of a close loved one. There are others of you in this room that got a result of a test that said that you had cancer or that you had some other health situation. Others of you had a change in job. Maybe you lost one, or you went through a job change that may cost you dearly. Others of you, you made some decisions that were a little bit difficult in order to deal with things financially. There are others of you that you experienced some of the deepest heartache, even privately behind the scenes, that maybe even no one knows about in your life. Maybe there were some questions that came up that just had caused you to go into some deep despair. Others of you faced some depressing situations. Many of us have faced those throughout the year, some deep, difficult things. And the reality of it is, if probably any of us knew that they were coming, probably every single one of us would probably choose to go a different direction. There's no one here that signs up for suffering. There's no one here that says, I'll take it. Now, probably all of us here would be willing if we said, hey, how many of you are willing to die for the gospel? Probably all of us would raise our hand, but every single one of us, if we knew there was a path that we would take to lead to that, would probably not intentionally take it. We would find a way out. We would find a way around. We would guide ourselves around the situation because our instinct as humans is to resist pain. Our instinct as people is to find ways around pain and difficulty. We don't set our lives up to be difficult. No one does that. I want you to imagine for a moment that you were given insight into what lies ahead in your life. Like you knew what was coming. How would you respond? How would you act? I don't know about you, but I would look for the path of least resistance. I would look for the easiest path if I could. I would look a way around all the things so that by instinct, by my very nature, I want it to be padded. I want it to be comfortable. Even when we're driving cars, for example, don't we take the path of least resistance? For example, if you knew there was going to be a squirrel driving out in front of you. Now, I've had this happen in my neighborhood, and I do everything in my power to miss that squirrel because I don't want to hurt a cute little squirrel. Now, if it was a cat, I'm kidding. Cat lovers, I'm kidding. No, I'm not. If you didn't know this, cats were counted as gods in the Egyptian world. That should tell you the problem. Cats are demonic. They are false gods. They think everybody owes them something. Just watch them. They're plagues. Some of you have to deal with that. You've got issues you got to deal with. No, I'm kidding. I love those of you that love cats. I get cat things every week from somebody, a cat card, a cat gift. I have a cat little statue in my office, and it reminds me of how miserable cats are. But I never will forget, we were riding. I was on a mission trip a few years back. We were riding on a back road in Haiti, and we were with a team here from our church, and we were in Haiti. And one of our missionaries, Pastor Luke St. Felix, he is a pastor. He's planted 40-some churches throughout Haiti, and we support him in his ministry. And we were going up to this feeding center. He has feeding center in schools or in churches all throughout Haiti. And we were going up to this one feeding center, and you drive through basically dry riverbeds, and you can only get there in the dry season. And we were driving up to this beautiful mountain area along the rocks and past the little rivers that would be flowing that one day throughout the year, a few days throughout the years, it would just fill up. And we were driving up into this mountain, and along the road, literally came out right in front of us was this goat. Now, the instinct is, when you're in a car and you see a pothole, you steer around it. It's just in us. It's ingrained in us. You may joke in your car 10 points and speed up, but really, you're not going to hit that. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You do the same thing. My boys, I say that to them all the time. This would be a 20-pointer if we hit this, I'm just kidding. We're joking around. Some of you know what I'm talking about, where you say, that's 20 points worth. Let's go. And you speed up, and they're like, no, you can't do that. Well, of course you're not going to hit anybody. You steer around goats. Well, Pastor Luke St. Felix, I'm sitting in the front. The rest of the team's kind of in the back, and I was sitting in the front with him. And he kind of just kept going as this goat came across the road. And the next thing you know, thump, 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 thump. And I look back through the rearview mirror, and I see this goat laying on the ground, cringing. Now, I know some of you are like, what about animal rights? Well, you say that in Haiti. And I looked over and I said, Pastor Luke, you just hit a goat, right? He goes, oh, I did? Like that. And I'm like, right, you didn't get that. And then he says this, and I don't forget this line. He says, somebody will get it and they'll eat it. And I thought, isn't that odd? In his own mind, he thought he was providing a meal for somebody by running over a goat in the middle of a road. My instinct was like, out of the way, steer the creek. I mean, I'll go into a crevice to not hit an animal, right? We do that. It's our instinct to get around danger, to get around things that may be uncomfortable. It's like he didn't want to throw the guys out of the back. He was caring for the guys in the back. It's like a kid. You've ever taken your kid to get a shot, or if you've ever gotten a shot yourself, what's the instinct? As the nurse says to you, this is going to just pinch a little bit. And as they say that, there's a little laughter, like, ha, 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 ha. It never hurts a little bit. I mean, it goes in and just burns sometimes. And so you watch, and what do? The instinct in us humanly is we cringe. And we'll wait, and she'll go, I already did it, it's over. Oh, okay, that wasn't so bad, right? This is our instinct, is to get around this. Now, I want you just for a moment to imagine with me. What if the things in our life, what if we saw the situations in our life as defining moments to our faith? Well, what if we actually grasp that what God was trying to do is shape us by the choices we make in the midst of suffering? That what suffering does is it not only tests our values, it reveals our commitment, and it shapes our character. Well, what if we determine that the things that we experience in this life that we have no clue are lying ahead will actually help define our faith instead of destroy our faith? Here's Jesus Christ, knowing full well that the time has drawn near to go to the cross. I mean, he's within a few hours, he will be hanging on a cross. And imagine that for a moment, that he knew it was going to happen. He knew it was coming. And it wasn't just the thought of physical brutality that overcame him. It was the reality of our sin, past, present, and future, being put on him on the cross. That is the context that we're going to read about this morning. And I'll just go ahead and say up front, this passage can be a bit unsettling for us as Christians because we see Jesus in a way that we've never seen him before. And yet there's a great mystery here. Now what I want to do as we dive in, it says this, verse 36, and we're going to go right through the text this morning. And let's read together. It says, then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which we know are James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to his disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me an hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and he prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink of it, your will be done. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and he prayed for a third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Now, what I want to do is paint a context for this story that we've just read. I want to paint with some pictures a bit of what's happening behind the scenes. They had just ended the Passover meal, and now they head to this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. Some interesting things I just want to pull out and give to you to read later on. The Passover ends with singing. In fact, the Passover usually ends with something called the Hallel. In Luke and in Matthew, it tells us that they sang a hymn. The hymn that they sung is called the Hallel. It's actually Psalm 113 through Psalm 118. Now, just for your own edification, I would encourage you this week to go read Psalm 118. And I want you to ponder how Jesus sang Psalm 118 as he was heading to his crucifixion. Think about that. When we read Psalm 118, man, it opens your eyes to what Jesus was experiencing from a physical standpoint. And it gives insight into maybe what he was thinking as he was singing a song, Psalm 118, as he was heading to these last hours of his life. It's eye-opening to read that. They make the journey to the Mount of Olives. Now, I want to give a little map here, and I want to show some pictures. This is a map. It's a little bit hard to see. This is taken in a current map, Google Maps. And what I did is marked with blue the area they would have walked. You can barely see it probably from where you're sitting, but up here you can see it pretty clearly. There's a little town. You can look this up at home on Google Earth. There's a little town called Cynical. Cynical is Latin for upper room. It's where it's traditionally believed to be the upper room where Jesus and his disciples gathered. From there, it's about a 30-minute walk today around the old city of Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives. And there you see the Garden of Gethsemane along the Kidron Valley. Now, in Jesus' day, this walk would have taken about 20 minutes. Today, you can still walk the same path that Jesus took. It's about a 20-minute walk. If you were going by Google Earth or by the directions they give, you would go along a smoother path, but it's about a 30-minute walk casually. And so this is the image here, about 20-minute walk. As they were walking, this is the path they would have taken. It's a place well known in Israel. It's where Roman steps, these are called the Roman steps. This is coming across the city of Jerusalem and overlooking the Kidron Valley. And these steps are still there today. You can walk them. These are the steps they believe were there during the time of Jesus. They were put in by the Romans. That's pretty awesome to think this morning. You can see next, this is the view from the temple, from the area of Jerusalem, looking down into the Mount of Olives. This is the view that would have happened. They would have come down along this city, and as they passed over a little small hill, they would have seen this beautiful place, this garden. Now, of course, this is a present-day picture. You can see in the background the Church of the Nations, which is where they believed traditionally Jesus prayed. No one knows exactly. It's a tourist site. But we know it's somewhere in this garden. We know somewhere in the midst of this. You go on, you can see, then they would enter this garden. This is a garden of groves. But before they get there, this is pretty cool. They would have passed an area called the graveyard of the prophets. This is a graveyard. If you look at the bottom, you can see the graves. This dates even before the time of Christ. They believed it was a place they buried prominent prophets. Even David himself has a grave right along this route. It's pretty interesting. And so as Jesus, I want you to picture this for a moment. As Jesus was walking this 20-minute walk with his disciples, them not grasping fully what was taking place, he walks by the graveyard, which is the grave of the kings and the prophets. And imagine here he is heading to his death, passing a graveyard. A well-known graveyard that dates back even before Jesus' day. Well-known, it was there then. Now today they have it built up even more. You can see there. It is even more people have been buried there throughout the centuries. They then would have entered this garden. This garden is a beautiful place. It is filled with olive trees. What's interesting about these olive trees is the word Gethsemane, this Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives, is actually this little place called Gethsemane is in the middle of this garden, this Mount of Olives. The reason why is Gethsemane means olive press. Here's an image of an olive press in the middle of Gethsemane. Take a look at it, and you can see around it. Now, how this would have worked is they would have taken the olives down, and they would put them inside this press, and they would have a donkey push, or a horse, a mule, push this thing around, and it would crush the olives, and it would make olive oil. And, of course, that's good for cooking, and it's good for bread. It's good to dip in, and so they would press this. Now, that's not olive oil. That is rainwater that turned green. So some of you are like, well, my olive oil doesn't look like that. Maybe we're doing something wrong. You don't want that oil, okay? But this is an image inside of the Garden of Gethsemane today. And there's still olive presses there to remind you of what Gethsemane means, which means olive press. You go on into the garden, somewhere in here, as we look at these trees, experts and researchers have dated to the time of Christ. In fact, what's interesting about an olive tree doesn't actually die. If you were to tear down or cut up an olive tree, the roots continue to live and will then come back out in another location and actually begin to sprout again. By the way, if you read any of history, you find that Jesus said something about a shoot springing up off of the olive tree. That's where it references, because the olive tree really doesn't die necessarily. In fact, some of these have been dated to the time of Jesus, or at least the offspring of the trees that were there during the time of Jesus. I get the image as Jesus walked through this garden. You wonder if he touched that tree. You wonder, is that the one? Is that where he sat? Is that where he prayed? Is that where the disciples fell asleep? It makes you wonder these things. Some pretty interesting stuff. What's interesting, another thing I want to point out, and we're going to come back to this, is that when he was in the garden, this is the view that you have from the Garden of Gethsemane. If you look back out of the Garden of Gethsemane, back toward the city Jerusalem, the city walls, this is the image. Now, why this is important is this. Here is Jesus in the midst of the Garden of Gethsemane, and when he looks back, it is the wall of Jerusalem. But not only a wall, there's a tower there. That tower is called the Gate Beautiful. That's a little close-up picture there. Still in the Mount of Olives, still in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's the image you have today. That little tower there is actually called the Gate called Beautiful. Do you remember the lame person? He was sitting by the gate called Beautiful. That was the entrance into the temple area, and right behind that wall, believe it or not, where that Dome of the Rock is, which is there now, the Muslims have a worship site, right behind that wall is what sat the Holy of Holies. Consider this for a moment. Jesus comes to the garden. Right behind him is this beautiful view that in that day was open and available. The temple was right behind the wall. And not only was a temple, but the Holy of Holies, where a priest enters once a year in Passover. Remember, it's Passover. One time a year, and he would take the blood of the sacrifice and he would pour it over the Ark of the Covenant. No one else entered the Holy of Holies. Only one man, the high priest, once a year. And that's what Jesus saw as he was praying in this garden. It paints for us a bit of the context as we read the story, the images that maybe had come up in his mind. It probably was about 10 to 11 o'clock at night. The Passover meal goes about 3 hours. Here he is sitting in a garden. Now, the question we want to ask is, why did he come here? Why did he go to the garden? Well, it's interesting because John and Luke tell us that Jesus and his disciples came to the garden regularly. In fact, when you read the story of the Gospels, you find whenever Jesus came into Jerusalem, he did 3 things. He ate at somebody's house, he went to the temple and taught, and he came to the Mount of Olives. Those 3 things are consistent. Anytime Jesus came to Jerusalem, he came to this place, this garden. And so it was a custom. In fact, John writes, Judas knew exactly where to come because they went there often. They knew to find him there. That it was in the Garden of Gethsemane where he would be. Now, the question I want to ask is why? Why did he come here? Was it because of the beauty? Was it because of the vantage point of Jerusalem? What was the thought process? Was it because, by the way, if I equated the Garden of Gethsemane to our day, it's a lot like calling it a national park. You know how you go like to the city park. By the way, I don't know if you knew this. The city park was picked as like the top 10, according to one magazine, city parks in the U.S. Now, if you live in Hagerstown, it's kind of funny. Hagerstown City Park. Drugs and parks. That's what I'm just kidding. It's actually not that far off, unfortunately. Why did Jesus come to Gethsemane? Was it because of the prophets? I want you to ponder this for a moment. Zechariah 14, which is a messianic prophecy about the second coming, says this. It says, on that day his feet shall stand, talking about the Messiah, on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in 2 from east to west. This is talking about the second coming of Christ. He is going to come back and stand on the Mount of Olives. Is that why he went there? Was it the hope that one day he was going to come back there as a king? Maybe so. Maybe that was a thought in his mind. Joel says this. Joel chapter 3 says, let the nations stir themselves up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. The valley of Jehoshaphat is the Kidron Valley, where the Mount of Olives is, and where the Garden of Gethsemane is. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Interesting. This is where he's going to judge. Is that why he came to the garden? I have a different perspective, and no one knows exactly why the garden. Why do they come back to the garden continually? But I find there's a lot of irony to this passage. And I want to just pull it out and let us wrestle with it for a while. I want you to think for a moment that here's Jesus in his last 24 hours coming, and John, if you read John 18, John emphasizes the garden. He calls it the garden with the word the in front of it. I find it very interesting. In the Greek, that means it's emphatic. He's pointing out it's a garden. Matthew calls it Gethsemane, a well-known garden, exactly where it is, we know. Why the garden? I find it very interesting that Jesus, in the last 24 hours, comes to a garden. Where did it all begin? Now, please know, I don't want you to leave here and say, Pastor Dave thinks the Garden of Gethsemane was the Garden of Eden. I don't. I just find it very ironic and maybe intentional that Jesus goes to a place before he goes to the cross as to where it all began. That it all began in a garden. In fact, the word Eden in Genesis, the word Eden in Hebrew, literally means beautiful, desirable, or paradise. Here in a beautiful, perfect garden, God put Adam and Eve and told them, listen, I'm going to give you every tree in the garden, but don't eat the one tree. The one tree I'm going to give you, don't eat the fruit of that tree. And remember, the serpent comes in Genesis chapter 3 and says to them, hey, listen, God told you not to eat, but I tell you, if you eat it, you're going to be like God. And Eve, it says, she saw that it was good to the eyes, she saw that it was good to taste, and she saw that she wanted it, and so she gave it to her husband who was with her, and they ate, and sin came upon all of us. And the New Testament says that you and I, it made that same choice in Adam, that we all chose sin just as Adam did, because his sin was our sin as well, and has been passed to us by birth continually, that we now have sin in our lives. We are born with that sin. We have that same problem. Here Jesus is, 24 hours left in his life before the cross, and in these 24 hours, he heads to a garden. And that garden is not called beautiful. That garden is called Gethsemane, which means oil press. In other words, it means to be crushed. The olives to be crushed. Isn't that ironic? The Garden Eden, beautiful. The Garden Gethsemane, crushed, pressed, difficult, struggle. That's the image we get here. I believe Jesus going to the garden to remind us this is all where it began. This is where temptation happened, and this is where we see a temptation happening for him. And I want to make some observations about this garden, and the first one is this garden was a place, the Garden of Gethsemane was a place of great suffering. Take a look at what he says. We're going to go right through the text. He tells his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. It's the only time in the entire New Testament where we find Jesus asking his disciples to pray for him. Nowhere else in the Gospels do we see Jesus asking them to pray for him except for here. He says, will you pray with me? He then takes his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he says, hey, come with me a little bit deeper. And he does the same with them. He takes them a little deeper. And John tells us, then he goes even further into the garden, and he says, a stone's throw away. So as far as you can throw a stone, that's about as far away as he went. And notice the description. It says, he became sorrowful and troubled. Verse 38, then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Now, if you want to get a glimpse of the experience of Jesus, the Bible does great here in to tell us how sorrowful and overwhelmed he was. In fact, it uses 3 different Greek words to describe what he felt. Yeah, this could have been summed up in one. Mark does it in one word, but Matthew gives us 3 words. Notice the first one. It says that he is sorrowful. The word literally means to be overwhelmed. It means to be mourning. That's the word to mourn here. He was, in some sense, in mourning. The second word is the word troubled. This word, by the way, it's in Greek, it's adominoin, which is kind of where we get the word Adam, which is kind of interesting. It's a whole other sermon, which means deeply distressed. In fact, the word is only used 3 times in the New Testament. The other 2 times it's used, it seems to have the definition of depression. So Jesus is under great mourning, even to the point of depression. And then Jesus, using a totally different word, gives a third word to describe himself, and it says, I am deeply sorrowful. Very unique word, by the way. He speaks of himself. I am deeply overwhelmed. It's the word where you get the word kind of his psyche is breaking down. That's what it means. In fact, notice how he describes it. He says, my soul, verse 38, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. What does he say? He's saying, listen, guys, I'm dying here. Men, I'm dying. Notice he's not saying I'm going to death. He is literally saying, I'm dying. I'm so overwhelmed. The word psyche is where we get the word psyche. His psyche is broken down. Mentally, he's breaking down is the picture here. He is dying. That's the image. In fact, Mark uses one word to describe this, and that word is only seen in the Gospel of Mark. It's pretty cool. It's the word ekthembasthai. It's a very unique word. It actually means terrified, surprised. Literally. In other words, the stress was so great that it was horrific, surprisingly. It's this. The image of this is like being scared, but not necessarily fear. Okay? I think of my boys. They every night we get together and we pray, and we kind of go into each other's room and we pray. And especially my younger boys, they always try to, and it's kind of fun to watch them, they always try to scare mom every single day, every night. When she comes up the step, they're hiding behind something, trying to scare her. It's a lot of fun. And I have them convinced that I don't get scared. So they don't try to get me, they try to get her. And they hide. One will hide behind a curtain, one will hide behind a door, one will hide under the sheets, under the covers. And they try every single night. Somebody's hiding to scare her. Last night it was my oldest son, David, and my third son, Jacob. And he hid behind one corner. And Allison is smart enough to know it's probably going to happen again, because it happened the previous 300 and some nights, or thousands of nights. It has happened every single night. But she comes up, and every once in a while, I know, because I know her well, sometimes she'll go along with it and be like, oh, and she's faking. And then other times they get her good, and those are great, high five moments, like, yeah, it was great, It's great being boys. I mean, that's just, to be honest, but she deals with that every single night. That's the image here to the greater power, as you can imagine, this is frightening, surprising. He is so overwhelmed, it's frightening. That's the word that Mark uses, only seen one time, and it's in the Gospel of Mark. That's the image here. He is just so overwhelming. It's frightening. It's just overwhelming. Now, the question we have to ask in this struggle of cosmic proportions that Jesus has experienced is why? What is it about this that's so overwhelming to him? Is it the fact that he's going to go to the cross, which is the most horrific death? Is it the nails that are going to be in his hands and the thorns that are going to be in his brow? What is it that makes this so horrific, so difficult, terrified, surprised? What is it that does that? Is it that he's going to be beaten? Is it that he's going to be tortured? I believe here it is much deeper than just physical. I don't believe it's just grieving over some nails. 30,000 criminals were tortured and killed on a cross by the Romans. They were masters of death. There were many that faced crucifixion. Something happened here that's deeper and more spiritual. In fact, notice Jesus' words. Verse 39, and going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, my Father, by the way, that word there is the word Abba, the same word that means daddy. There's only one time where Jesus doesn't call him Father, and it's on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? The only place he calls him God. Every other place is Father, and here it's Abba, daddy. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Now, the question, if we're going to answer why was he experiencing such agony, is we have to answer the question, what is the cup? What does this cup represent? Well, it's interesting because there are two sides of this coin. I want to share both of them because they're pretty powerful. The one side is the Roman side, and the other side is the Jewish understanding. I want to start with the Roman side. The Romans had some interesting thoughts. The Romans were masterminds of death. In fact, even their soldiers had some rules they had to follow. If you were to be let's say a Roman centurion, if you were going to be a Roman soldier, and this will relate well with the men here, if you were going to be a Roman soldier, you had to take an oath called the sacramentum. The sacramentum said this. The sacramentum said, I will defend, and this is what it says, Caesar, Senate, and people. And of course, if you know the Roman history, if you've ever watched Gladiator, this follows that. They were led by Caesar, but they had an elected Senate. And that's where, by the way, we get our government is from the Romans. If you didn't know that, that's where you were like, yeah, I already know that. Dictators and all that. No, I'm just kidding. Don't. That's how we get this, right? It's the idea of the Romans. They had an elected Senate, and then Caesar who was in line to take the throne. That's how it works. So there was both happening. It was not democratic. It was definitely a type of republic is how they tried to rule it, but it was very different. It was truly a dictatorship, and at times they were at odds with each other. So if you've ever seen movies during the Roman Empire, you see the odds between Caesar and the Senate. But a Roman soldier took an oath to protect Caesar, Senate, and people. And there were some rules they had to follow. In fact, those Roman soldiers, if they ever tried to, because Rome was led by fear. That's how they ruled for so many years. They were one of the greatest empires ever in history. And the reason for that is because they ruled by fear. people were afraid. Crucifixion was one of the things they came up with so that people would fear them. But this is pretty interesting because even Roman soldiers, they were afraid that Roman soldiers would feel the weight of the Roman Empire that they would begin to start to rise up against. They were afraid of betrayal and traitors, and they were afraid of insurrections rising. That's why Jesus became an outcast in the Roman Empire, because they believed he was raising insurrections. So what they would do is they would tell these soldiers, here are some rules. And there were many, many rules they had to follow, things that they weren't allowed to do. But there were 4 ways specifically, these are the 4 greatest ways they would put a Roman soldier to death for trying to start an inquisition against them. So here's how it worked. First of all was crucifixion. You and all your buddies, if you were a soldier and you tried to say something evil about Rome or you tried to overthrow Rome, they would go and crucify you. The second one was they would try to embarrass you. And what they would do is they would strip you down and let your clothes hang at your ankles, and they would burn you. And they would burn you up. They were cruel, but they were ruling by fear. The third thing they would do, and this is, it gets a little bit deeper here, is they would say, okay, we've got a group of soldiers. We don't know who they all are, but we're going to take this whole legion of soldiers, and one of them is causing an insurrection. And you know how guys are, right? Especially if you're banding together and you're doing, right, you're in the army or military together and you're a soldier together. You don't want to tell who's the one. You don't want to be the tattletale. I mean, that's kind of even though at the beginning we tattletale, that's kind of the thing that we all make fun of, right? Don't be a tattletale, we tell our kids. So what happens? They would say, okay, we're going to line you up. What they do, they line up the soldiers and they would just randomly have them line up along a cliff and they would begin to push them off. You guys, and this is how they would do it. They would say, one of you can tell us who is it that started this. Once you tell us, we'll stop pushing. And their hope was that somebody would speak up and say, it was him. And they would stop. So that was one of the ways. The fourth way, and this is where I want to focus for a moment, in the Roman world was called a cup of suffering. What this is they would take, a commanding officer would have a suspected leader of the insurrection, someone trying to overthrow them. They knew who would be leading. They had an idea of who was leading it. And so they did this fourth way called the cup of suffering. What they would do is they would take a cup and they would fill it with hemlock. Now, if you know anything about hemlock, if you've ever read Romeo and Juliet, that's what they drink at the end to take their lives. Hemlock is a poison. It's a poison that Rome came up with. It is a mixture of a bunch of chemicals, and it's a poison. And what they would do is they would fill up a cup with hemlock. They would line the soldiers up with the first one who they suspected who is doing this or causing this insurrection. And what they would say is this: you must drink the entire cup or pass it on to the next person, and they will then have to drink. Until it is all drunk, you will pass it on. So here's how they do it. They suspect it, so let's just use an example. Rick Everett, he's a good example for me. Not because he does anything wrong, but just because he's a good guy to pick. Let's say they thought he was the one who started an insurrection against Rome, line up all the soldiers and say, okay, Rick, here's the deal. You can drink this hemlock by a sip, or you can drink it all so that no one else will die. Now, if you drink a sip of hemlock or you drink a whole cup, you're going to die no matter what. So the choice is, do you drink it and save all of your fellow soldiers, or do you take a sip and pass it on until somebody drinks it all? And that was called in the Roman world the cup of suffering. Do you see it? This was from a Roman standpoint, Jesus taking a cup of suffering. However, there was also a Jewish perspective. And I want to give that because I think that is what is controlling this text here. The Jewish perspective is found in Isaiah and multiple prophets. In Isaiah 51, the prophet Isaiah writes to Israel and says, wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his what? His wrath. You who have drunk to the dregs to the bowl, the cup of staggering. All throughout the Old Testament, there is a description of God's wrath being poured out in a cup. Go to the book of Revelation, it's the exact same thing, that God's wrath is stored in a cup, and there's an eventual time where people will drink of the cup of God's wrath. Now, Isaiah 51 is a pretty powerful passage. I think it is prophetic to this moment because Isaiah 51, later verse 21 and 22 says this: therefore, hear this, you who are afflicted, who are drunk, but not with wine. Now notice this: thus says your Lord, the Lord your God, who pleads the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken from your hand, do you see it? I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering, the bowl of my wrath, so that you do not have to drink it. So the picture is that the Messiah would take the cup of the wrath of God for himself so that people do not have to experience it. So Jesus is here in the garden, realizing that in a few moments he is going to be hanging on a cross, and that's not what he's worried about because that's a bit of physical pain that will end. But it is the glimpse of him, the understanding of him taking upon himself the weight of the wrath of God, the sin of us all, and the payment of that sin that should be on us that's now going to be placed on him. And Luke says the intensity of this moment is so agonizing that his capillaries begin to explode inside of him, and he begins to sweat great drops of blood. A word called hematrosis or hemadrosis. It has the idea where your capillaries behind your skin, there inside your veins, begins to pop, and because the pores are open through sweat, it begins to seep through your pores, and you begin to sweat blood. Luke describes as sweating great drops of blood because of the torment of this night. Now, before we go any further, here is Jesus saying, can you let this cup pass from me? And I'm not meaning to be graphic. I'm meaning to be scriptural, that this is what he was facing so that we get a glimpse of what he's saying here. Now, the question, I want to make a couple observations, and these are theological observations about this moment. And what I'm trying to do is make sure we understand the text. We can all read it and just pass over, but what is it really saying to us? And I want to kind of bring this back for a moment to our lives. And I want to make these are contrasting observations, theological, in the text. First of all, the suffering of Jesus here in the garden was focused not only on his humanity, but his divinity, his deity. We can read this as Christians and be like, yeah, this is Jesus as a man feeling this. Folks, what we gather from this text is not just that Jesus is a man worried about crucifixion. What we gather is that Jesus is God overwhelmed with the idea that God who had never seen sin is now going to experience sin somehow in the mystery of the cross. And he's saying, let this cup pass from me. As one author said, we cannot comprehend the depth of Jesus' agony because as sinless and holy God incarnate, he was able to perceive the horror of sin in a way that we cannot. He was able to understand because you and I touch sin, we're born in this world of sin, but a holy, infinite God who is about to take sin upon himself in the mystery of the cross, for him, the idea of sin was so beyond our ability to understand. He was in agony over it. And that's not a man thing, that's a God thing. That's deity. You follow me? We're going to rack our brains here for a moment theologically. I think we have to. If you want to understand the scriptures, you better think. This is one of those moments. Secondly, I believe the measure of Christ's agony in the garden expresses the magnitude of the suffering which Christ would endure on the cross. If Christ was in agony in the garden, certainly what he was in agony over was going to be even more greater and even farther and more deep than what he experienced there. The thing he agonized over was going to be a far greater consequence. So to know, man, the cross must have been absolutely horrible, not because of nails and scars and things like that, but because of sin that was going to be placed on him. It had to be horrible for him to go through this night. Right, I've said this before, but why not just show up and go right to the cross? This is a demonstration of all these things. He's saying, man, this is the magnitude of this we grasp. Thirdly, I believe it demonstrates, this measure of Christ's agony in the garden demonstrates the depth of our sinfulness and its disastrous consequence. I mean, the fact that he agonized over taking our sin tells us how sinful we are. I mean, the fact that he would spend this moment in turmoil over it says, man, it must be pretty bad for God who knew what he's doing to feel this. And lastly, another observation I make is it describes the enormity of God's love for us. I just get that image of him looking up to that mountain right behind him, and there behind that wall is the Holy of Holies. And he knows there's a veil there waiting. And that in just a few hours, that veil is going to tear so people can now come to God themselves. And I can't help but to think, wow, this demonstrates the deep love of God for me. And that he would endure that. As someone once said, the value of something is always determined by how much you're willing to pay for it. The fact that he is willing to be in this agony in order to pay for my sin, says how much he loves me, how much he loves you. Now, I want to move from the suffering, which we can barely understand, to the success. I believe this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, was also a place of great success. Take a look at it with me. Verse 39, he says, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Now let me explain what's happening here. This is a bit of a test for Jesus. Here he is, not only, I believe, humanly, but also divinely, feeling the weight of something he had never experienced, which is sin, about ready to come upon him. And I believe here that every neuron in his body, every cell, every nerve impulse, everything in his body was raging, I'm out, gone. It's over. I'm not going through with it. I want out of this. If there'd be any possible way, I'll take it. I feel everything in his body was raging, get me out, get me out, get me out. Let it pass from me. Why? Because it's real to do that. As we said, it's our nature to do that. And I believe everything in him was saying, I'm done. I don't want to go on. I don't want to face it. And yet he responds with the 7 words, not my will, but yours be done. Now, I want you to gather this for a moment. So everything in him was saying, if there is anything possible, let it pass. Now, you and I, we're going to face things in our life. Every single one of us have faced things. I remember back when I was 8 years old and my dad passed away. I remember that vividly, that moment that it happened. I remember being at Winter Street Elementary School and my sister coming up to get me and she says, Dave, listen, don't lose it. Keep it together right now. And I got into a car, and there was my mom. She was wearing sunglasses. I remember it like I was there yesterday. And I never will forget, I held it together. I didn't cry for a good while. And then I remember vividly the moment where it hit me that my dad had died. I was actually sitting in the bathroom. Now, what I was doing in there doesn't matter. But I was sitting in the bathroom, and I remember 8 years old just being overwhelmed with this thought that God had done this. I had accepted Christ in February. My dad died a few months later. And I remember having this wrestling match with God, as in, God, why would you do that? Why would you do this, God? And I remember raising my fists in the air, and I remember saying, God, why? Why? Right? A fair question. If there was a way for me to get out of that, if there was a way for me to change that, I remember the morning my dad passed away, I had an ear appointment, had a lot of issues with my ears before, still partially deaf in one ear. But I remember at the ear, I remember these things vividly well. And, I look back and I remember thinking, God, why? When we face pain, and by the way, that's just one example of many in our lives that we all have faced. That was one example for me. I can share with you 100 different more, 1,000 different more times where I wish I could have changed something. I wish I could have done something different. We don't get it back. Now I just want to gather this for a moment. If I could go back, maybe there would have been, could I have tried to help no, of course not. My dad died of emphysema by his own choosing in many ways because of his own sinful choices and the consequence of that he had to face. But I remember questioning God about that, right? And I still sometimes question God. Now I want you to imagine for a moment, here is Jesus. See, if you know where you're headed and you head there, you can't question. Here's Jesus heading to a place he knows full well is going to happen. Follow me. He knows where he's going. But not only does he know where he's going, he has the power to stop it. You and I had no power to stop my dad from passing. I have no power to stop people from being sick with cancer. I have no power over something taking place with my kids' health. I have no power over these things. But here is Jesus, who not only knew what was going to take place, had the power to stop it. In fact, Luke says that he had the power to call 10,000 angels. At that moment, he could have said the word, the Father show up and say, all right, you're out of here, son. I'm not letting you go through this. At any moment, he had the power to stop it. And he says, not my will, be done. See, you and I don't have the power to stop things. Jesus had the power to stop it, the ability to stop it. And he didn't. Instead, he looked up to the Father and he said, not my will, but yours be done. In fact, I want to show you the progression. This is powerful. Notice in verse 39, he says, nevertheless, probably the biggest nevertheless in the Bible, not as I will, but as you will. He goes out and he sees them sleeping. He goes, verse 42, again for the second time, he went away and prayed. And notice this, my Father, if this cannot pass until I drink. But notice, notice he has admitted it's the Father's will. And in the second time, he says, if I can't let it pass, then your will will be done. In other words, you see the progression? He's already admitting, I know it can't pass. I know I have to drink of this cup of wrath. I know that I have to experience this. And so, Father, your will be done. He's admitting that he knows it's going to happen and it cannot pass. And so it says, your will be done. And it says he did it a third time in verse 44. He's saying the same words. The garden was a place of great success. I want you to think about this for a moment. Remember Adam and Eve? In that garden called beautiful, what did they say? Their response to God was, our will, not yours. Our will. We'll do it our way. I'll take the fruit because the temptation comes and Adam and Eve say, my will be done. That's all of us, right? We say, I want my way. I want my will. I want my desires. And here is Jesus in the garden with the ability to get out of it. And he says, no, not my will, but your will be done. That's why Paul writes in 1st and 2nd Corinthians that he is the second Adam. The first Adam brought sin. The second Adam, Jesus, brings life. The first Adam brought damnation to us all. He ruined us. The second Adam brings rescue to us all. Here in this garden called pressed, crushed, Jesus withstands and we see success. He's willing to take all the things that you and I struggle over in this life. He's saying, Lord, your will be done. Be it on me. Thirdly and lastly, I want to bring this back to our lives. This garden is a place that we can find strength. That we can find strength. The war was won at the cross, but the battle was won in the garden. Without Jesus submitting to the Father in obedience, we get no cross. So here we are this morning, and we're all in this broken garden, aren't we? We're in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's crushing and pressing and broken and struggle and strife and issues and situations, and they come against us at times. But this is meant to be for us a great encouragement, an outstanding encouragement. In fact, the writer of Hebrews, I believe, grasped this text. Not a lot is said about this idea of Jesus in the garden, but I believe the writer of Hebrews grabs this. And if you want to turn there, you can, and we'll put it on the screen. But Hebrews chapter 4 and 5 give us insight into why Jesus is qualified to be the high priest. And in chapter 5, verse 7, it says this about Jesus. Describing, I believe, this moment. It says this. It says, in the days of his flesh, in the days he was on earth, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. It goes on and says, and he was found obedient in his perfection. A lot of scholars believe this is talking about the cross. I don't believe that's talking about the cross because once he's on the cross, it's done. I believe here it's actually talking about the point that he was obedient to the Father in the garden. That's what the text goes on to say. And because he was obedient as man and as God, he now qualifies to us as a high priest. And that's why it says right before this is kind of how he qualifies. Here is what he then does. Chapter 4, verse 14. It says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. In the garden he was tempted. Get out. I'm done. I'm finished. I'll take another way. Get out of jail free card. He was tempted in every way we are, yet without sin. Let us then, notice the response, let us then with confidence. No, whoa, wait. My ground is shaky. My life is at times in misery. I'm going through struggles. There's times of depression and overwhelming sense of sorrow and grief and agony. And yet he says, listen, consider the garden. Consider Christ who was able to withstand without sin. And now it says, let us with confidence. The word confidence is one of my favorite words. It's the idea of firm standing, unmovable, immovable. Let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. There is no question. that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Remember where Paul says in 2 Corinthians, where he says, your grace is sufficient. In our greatest time of need, I think of the garden and I get grace and confidence to stand when everything around me is falling apart. In fact, I find it very interesting, if we go back to Matthew 26, I find it very interesting, the interaction with the disciples. Clearly, I want you to just grasp for a moment, here is God, Jesus, facing his most unbearable moment, facing the most difficult moment he had on earth, getting ready to go to the cross, agonizing over that. And here his closest buddies are sleeping. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have cast them off as friends pretty quickly. It may have even caused me, when Judas showed up, as we're going to talk about next week, showed up with his spears and guards, I may have said, hey, take them out with me. Right, here they are in this darkest moment, and they're sleeping. I mean, imagine this. I always said this, and I want to remind us, I know I've said this 100 times before, but I need this reminder as much as probably you do. If I was doing this deal, here's how I would have showed up. I would have put a red cape on. If I was God, I would have put a red cape on. I may have wore a Spidey outfit, because they're cool. And I would have zipped down, if you didn't know, Chad Gross was a Spider-Man comic model for Marvel. That's kind of weird to say a model, Chad. Actor, okay. I would have showed up on earth, right? Here's how I would have done it. Remember, we're going to talk about in a couple weeks the trials of Jesus. I would have claimed to be God because they crucified him for blasphemy. I would have just said it, hey, I'm God, because he was. I would have then let them put me on the cross. I would have died for the sins of humankind, and I would have gotten out of here as quick as I could have. Here I am, zip, zip, boom, done. But Jesus didn't. Jesus came and lived for 33 and a half years on this earth, felt what we felt the weight of our pressures, the difficulties of our lives, the struggles that we face, even here in the garden, the intense pressure of wanting to get out. And Jesus says, nope, your will be done, Father. And if there's any proof that if I was God, I would have been out, would have been my closest friend sleeping on me in my darkest time. But it's interesting in this interchange between Jesus and his disciples, 3 times he uses the word watch. Do you see it? He comes to them and he says, watch and pray. The second time he comes to them, they're sleeping, and he says, watch. The word here is the word Gregoria. It's where we get our word Gregory or Gregorian chant. That's where it comes from. It's the idea of Gregoria. It means to watch, but actually, you know what it actually means? It means life. It means to live. The idea of this is you shouldn't be asleep. You should be awake. You should be alive. You should be watching. And so 3 times Jesus comes to his disciples. And I don't believe this is just a momentary thing. I believe these words connect with us. In fact, notice Jesus connects them to their temptation. And he says to Peter, so could you not watch with me an hour? Verse 41, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The word here is, man, alive. We ought to be alive. Now, you're here this morning and you're facing difficulty. And you know what our instinct is in difficulty? Our instinct is to sleep. Right? I don't know about you, but when things are going tough, I just want to take a nap. I want to sleep it off. I just want to get away. I don't want to sit down and turn on TV and watch and write, just unfinished. And Jesus here says, no, in your temptation, wake up. In your temptation, be alive. In your temptation, watch. Why? Because you have a high priest who's endured what he knew, what he could have changed, but he didn't. So that you and I, in our everyday decisions, could say, not my will, but yours be done. Some of you this week are going to get a phone call, and you're going to have to make a decision, not my will, but yours be done. This week, something's going to happen in our lives. Every one of us are going to experience that moment. And we're going to have to make the choice to say, I will not be asleep. I will be ready. And I will say, your will be done. D.A. Carson said about this text in writing, a well-known theologian, he said, as his death was unique, so also was his anguish. And our best response is to have a hushed worship I love that. What can we say to these things? Except, wow, wow, what a God, what a God. Let's stand as we pray this morning.